Thank you. Ampun Tuanku, Your Royal Highness, guests, friends, Assalamualaikum, and thank you really for staying on. It's been heavy going. It's not an easy subject, and we did not make it any easier. And it's nice because we often have discussions on a very general level. It's always good to have some serious meat going on, and I can't find more meaty discussions than the ones we've had today. You've met all the panelists before. You've heard all of them speak. I'd just like to introduce you to Dato, Dr. Tilinathan, who's been an economist, a banker. He's worked in Genting Berhad, and is now on the board of ideas and does many other good things. So this is the last session, and it'd be nice to kind of come to grips with what we've discussed the whole day and decide what it is we have learned. We heard Professor Arjun talk earlier about the very international dimension of inequality. We heard Alan then talk about very good analysis of Malaysian data on inequality. Prof. Jomo talking about what the government has or has not done to promote inequality. And of course, Prof. Ravi talking about how we can't solve inequality domestically. It's a global problem. It requires global solutions. These are all really big issues. But before I get into that and ask them, perhaps I'll ask Dato' Tili to say a few things. You heard all the others, so I'll get Dato' Tili to say a few things. Yeah.
Your Royal Highness, distinguished participants and friends, Professor Ravi Kanpur has made an excellent presentation. His two key propositions, firstly, that forces of technology, globalization, and migration has led to a rising trend in inequality. And secondly, that in competing for capital and talent through lower taxes, countries have been constrained in using the fiscal system in managing inequality at the national level. Professor Kanpur has also set out what are the institutional developments required at the global level to manage inequality at the national level. Given my limitations and my own interests, I will confine myself to reviewing the Malaysian experience and the way forward for managing growth and inequality. In the pre-independence period, the forces of globalization, technology, and migration led to both growth and inequality in the country. In the post-independence period, and in particular after the '69 riots, the key focus has been reducing poverty and in reducing inequality between the races. The government opted to reduce interracial inequality not through disruptive redistribution, but via growth. Growth was generated by integrating Malaysia once again to the global economy. We opted for export-oriented manufacturing through the use of labor-intensive technology. By late 80s, Malaysia was able to transition from a labor surplus, low-income country to a fully employed middle-income country. There was also a significant reduction in interracial inequality. From 1990, despite full employment, Malaysia has continued to rely on an export-oriented strategy and use labor-intensive technology. As a small country, we have no choice but to still opt for globalization. But do we need to import cheap, unskilled labor to drive growth? The percentage share of foreign workers increased from 3% back in 1990 to at least 15% in 2014, of which 95% was unskilled. This strategy has made for higher growth, but the less skilled workers have not shared in the rising prosperity as their real income has stagnated. This has not caused much concern to the government, possibly because the share of unskilled has declined from about 1/3 of the labor force to 14% over the 01 to 2014 period. Further, rising education level of most Malaysians have enabled them to improve their skills and enjoy a higher income in line with rise in national income. But easy import of unskilled labor and restrictions on import of educated employees also led to higher interpersonal income inequality than what it would have been otherwise. To date, interpersonal income distribution has not been a source of much concern in Malaysia. Why do I say this? We look at income inequality, post-tax and transfers only declined by 2% over much of the post-2000 period. If you look at the annual effect. On the other hand, in the OECD world, taxes and transfers caused the income inequality to decline by almost 1/3. Further, in spite of what Alan Ng says, nonetheless, labor share of income only averaged about 48% over a long period in the first and second decade of this millennium. So while the labor share of income only averaged 48% in Malaysia, it was about 50 to 75% higher in the OECD world. Even in Thailand, which is a middle-income country like Malaysia, labor share was 76%, more than 50% higher than Malaysia's share. Labor share of income matters. When the share of asset owners are high, this means the forces equalizing opportunities may be a lot weaker because you have inheritance and the likes. Now, despite the global constraint that Professor Kanpur has eloquently elucidated, I still believe, since he's still not so very confident that it will be implemented for some time at the global level, so it is more important for us to look at what we can do at a national level. So I submit that there is still a lot more room for use of the fiscal system to reduce inequality. Corporates don't pay much taxes because we give very generous fiscal incentives, and that has increased during the Dollah Badawi and Najib administration. This can be effected, so we can use the fiscal system not only by making it more progressive, but it also can be effected by using the huge GST revenue base to carry out the transfer programs, I feel, or invest in education, and by opting for competitive bidding and by cracking down on waste and looting, which can throw up lots of savings, a lot of resources for development and for redistributing income to the really needy. Malaysia is still preoccupied by an affirmative action agenda that is race-based. There are strong grounds why we should shift to a more need-based affirmative action agenda. Between race component now only accounts for 3.5% of total income inequality. With such a shift to a more need-based affirmative action agenda, the vast majority of the beneficiaries will still be the Bumiputra. Further, a race-based affirmative action agenda is more vulnerable to capture by special interests. This is apparent in Malaysia over the last 2 decades or so. Rent-seeking has led to crony capitalism and money politics, that is to the emergence of institutions which are more extractive and even repressive. This, I submit, is inimical to our ambition to become and sustain ourselves as a high-income country. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have to have a further discussion on the numbers you were quoting just now, Italy, because I think they slightly disagree with what our numbers are. And before we carry on, I'd just like to put a bit of context to, Alan was talking just now about inequality in Malaysia, and he said the B40, the bottom 40%, if you compare what the top 20% earn, it used to be the top 20% used to earn on average 9 times, about 10 times more, and now it's about 5 times more. So this improvement in inequality over time. And he also gave this nice figure about how much the T10 makes, how much the T1 makes, and how much the T0.1 makes. So some of the things we have found out in looking at Malaysian income inequality is that Malaysian income is not spread evenly geographically. So if you look at what the median income is, half the people who earn below the median income, which is half the population, live outside the city centers, particularly Klang Valley, Kuala Lumpur. And the half which earn more than the median income typically live in Kuala Lumpur. So what you get is that in Kuala Lumpur, you have a very perverse idea of how much people work, how much people earn, because most of the people are actually people who are already in the top 50%. And if your typical Kuala Lumpur couple is a young married couple, both graduates, they probably earn more than 10,000 ringgit a month, which puts them in the top 10%. So if I look around here, most of the people here are graduates. Many of them probably are married to graduates. So you're looking at a population here which is in the top 10%, discussing the issues of the bottom 40%. So this idea that, do we know enough really about what's going on at the bottom 40% to start talking about it? So Arjun, I'd like to start with you actually, because you showed us just now the herds of elephants and how inequality is a feature in all countries and how it's come down over the years. So there was a question asked earlier about what level of income inequality is a sufficient level, and you said it depends on the context. But take any context you like. I mean, what is is there such a thing as an acceptable level of income inequality? Because we're not going for Gini of zero. We're not going for everybody earning the same. So what is it that's so bad about income inequality, which you found in all the countries you looked at?
Okay. So I haven't actually done that kind of analysis to see what is an ideal level of inequality or what people. I think it's pretty clear that any level of inequality where people start to rebel politically against that is sufficient sign that there's a problem. Right. And in fact, then it might be that might actually be too high. There may be what Ravi was referring to. There may be signs under even a relatively low threshold that in fact there's a lot of social unrest. So I would say that in certain countries where you actually see conflict, that would be above the level of inequality that you want. I don't think you can actually give a number to that. There's no meaning to that.
So if people start shooting each other, then you know inequality's gotten too
certainly,
bad?
I think that's definitely a sign. But even before that, if people feel, if you see crime going up, if you see people trying to vote, you see populism, these kind of things, these are signs, I think.
No, because when the IMF first started talking about inequality, it was amazing for the IMF to talk about inequality. But when they started talking about it, one of the reasons they said was inequality was bad, that for the reason you just said, if it's bad, you get social unrest. But it kind of suggests that it's a way the rich look after themselves, right? Just keep them poor, but not so poor that they rebel against you, but just poor enough so that you're rich. Is that how we should view inequality, as a kind of idea that how to keep balance in society as opposed to any kind of moral issue?
Of course, there's a lot of philosophical literature on inequality and what should be, most recently, I suppose, the biggest thing was Rawls and things that followed from Rawls. Again, that doesn't translate to a number, so it's hard for me to give you an answer like that. But there are, better philosophical undergirdings for that. But I think Ravi wanted to answer this.
Ravi's got the answer, though. Yes.
I've got the answer, but I do have one aspect of the way we measure inequality, maybe throwing us off. So you mentioned T20, B40, etc., etc. So consider the following example. There's somebody who who gets $1,000 a ringgit, and somebody who has 1 million ringgit. Double both of those. So the person who gets 1,000 ringgits now has 2,000, and Bill Gates now has 2 million. So this person's income went up by 1,000, Bill Gates' went up by 1 million. Would you say inequality in that society has gone up? Most people intuitively would say yes. But the Gini coefficient will not change. Because the Gini coefficient is a relative measure of inequality. Doubling everybody's income leaves the Gini coefficient unchanged, leave all these measures that we talk about, leave them unchanged. And yet the absolute gap has widened. And so it can well be that the Gini has remained unchanged, and there's unrest in society because people are responding to the absolute gap, not the relative difference between the two. So that's one observation that I would have. So the question is, the Gini is, let's say Gini Malaysia has been stable, why are people unhappy? Well, here is one route to understanding that happiness.
No, again, Alan's numbers, right? The top 10% make 13,000 ringgit a month. The top 1% make 43,000 ringgit a month, and the top 0.1% make 140,000 ringgit a month. Now, you don't find the top 1%, 0.1% in the rural areas, nor do you find the top 1% in the rural areas. Maybe some of the top 10% you may find in the rural areas. They're all concentrated here in Kuala Lumpur. So, if you look at it, if you look at gatherings such as this, of the top 10%, for example, the top 1%, the top 10% of the 10% are the top 1%. So you are sitting here earning 13,000 ringgit, and you're looking at someone earning 43,000 ringgit, and you feel a great disparity. And that's the top 10% of your cohort. And then, of course, the top 1% of your cohort, the top 0.1%, end up earning $140,000, which is like 10 times what you earn. And it's almost like we can't stop. This idea of of inequality and who you're measuring who against. Prof, what do you think? Is this? Sorry, the old prof. Sorry, Jomo, what do you think? Because you've been studying Malaysian inequality, and what is an appropriate level of inequality? Or is there even such a thing as an appropriate level of inequality? Because by most standards, 13,000 a month in Malaysia is a very good salary. But if you sit in Kuala Lumpur and all you do is mix around with people who are in the top 1%, the 0.1%, you suddenly feel, rather hard done by if you only earn 13,000 and everybody else earns 100,000.
I think the challenge, I don't think there's a single number, and many people would like to say that what we have in Northern Europe, Northeast Asia, which is around 30% Ginies, is a basis for social peace. I am not sure. If you consider, for example, the Breivik incident, where Breivik, a young man, took some automatic rifles and went to the island where the young Labour Party activists were organizing, were having a training camp, and he basically killed about almost 90 of them and injured many, many more. The Breivik incident basically suggests that even in relatively equal societies, it doesn't take much to organize on the basis of ethno-populism. It's always easy for, if unconstrained by anti-racist laws and so on, to blame the other. Because the other is something which you don't know, and it's easy to attribute all kinds of things to the other. So what has happened in, say, Sri Lanka, of blaming the other, or elsewhere, including here, is something which I think even if you have a relatively low level of inequality, it's relatively easy to mobilize. So I think you really need more than just having a low level of inequality in order to avoid such. And I think Tan Sri Andrew's point earlier is that you need to have a more positive basis for building social consensus. It's not just and this is why I think having a broad meaning for patriotism, of looking after the national interests. All the so-called nationalists in this country are not really nationalists; they're ethno-populists. What you really need is a sense of, of an identity about Malaysia, for example, which goes beyond an ethnic or a culturalist or a regional identity. And this, I think, is still lacking. Of course, slogans such as making America first, for example, purports to be nationalist. But it's actually, in fact, as we know, it's not nationalist. It's actually ethno-populist in the context of North America and many other situations. So, unfortunately, I don't think there are easy guarantees of social peace.
Arjun, you saying something?
Yeah, I wanted to link what Jomo just said with the sort of broader questions which Ravi asked, and I'm glad that I get to return the compliment and the compliment that from this morning. I think there's a reason why our global institutions are not doing their job or are unable to do their job. And I'd add another constraint or another vacuum, and I would say that's a global ideological vacuum. We had, Andrew had earlier today mentioned moral crisis. I would actually think about it really as an ideological vacuum, and people have been saying on and off, let's not litigate the 70s and the 80s. But frankly, in policy, the 70s and 80s have been litigated through the 90s. In the West, for example, there's an attack on welfare, and then suddenly people are surprised that people react in a bad way, with either through Brexit or through Trump or whatever it is. In general, I think it's also indicative that the one international institution which does have teeth and that we just alluded to happens to be one which is actually disequalizing, and I think that's the TRIPS agreement and the World Trade Organization. Right? So I think none of this can be understood without having an overarching sense that there's a global institutional, global ideological vacuum as well to add to all the vacuums that we have.
Gosh, okay, thank you. Sorry, Dazili, yeah.
What is acceptable level of inequality?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm referring to the example that Professor Kanpur gave, that if income rises, income of the rich and the poor guy doubles, one from 1,000 to 2,000, the other one from 1 million to 2 million, I will not just look at the pre-tax income, but also post-tax income. So if even we are only taxing at the marginal rate of 25%, the extra, from the 2 million that whoever is earning, we are getting 500,000. And on an after-tax basis, the ratio is 300, roughly, I think, 1.5 divided by 2. On after-tax basis, because there is also distribution, that 500,000 get distributed. So obviously, the after-tax income of the poor guy has gone a lot more, whereas, so I would have no problem, especially if that extra income is earned. If it is not earned income, maybe from ownership of assets and the like, maybe that could be taxed at a higher level. This is something. And similarly in Malaysia, capital gains is not being taxed. Then again, we are disadvantaging labor income at the expense of. So these issues that we need to look at. I don't mind looking at Gini coefficient as a measure, even if it's only a relative measure. And if OECD world, the Gini coefficient, the average, this is what the World Bank report gave, and I took that number from there, was 46%, but post-tax and post-transfer reduces to 32%. So that's still a positive change. And so I have no problem using Gini coefficient as a measure. I have no problem with some amount of inequality, so long as there is some measure of progressive taxation, and also there is equalization of opportunity.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. This difference between Gini being a relative measure in percentage terms, and what really bothers people is dollar terms, ringgit terms. How much more ringgit do you earn than me? Not how many X times more. We've been talking a little bit in our presentations about the structure of the Malaysian economy, which is quite dependent on migrant labor. So depending on how you do the numbers, anything between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 members of the workforce are not citizens of the country. I guess two things from that, and I'd like all of you to say a few words on this. One is, do you think that is part of the causes of income inequality in the country, the very structure of the economy being very reliant on low-skilled, poorly paid migrant worker? And secondly, when we talk about Gini and we talk about the welfare of Malaysians, should we even be considering what migrant workers? I mean, I know Prof. Jomo has said that we are understating the Gini coefficient and understating the amount of inequality because we don't include migrant workers. But should we? I mean, or are we not? Or is this, to choose a phrase used by someone else? Should we just put Malaysia first and Malaysia for Malaysians and worry about Malaysian income inequality rather than income inequality amongst migrant workers? So maybe I'll start with you, Arjun, because simply because you happen to be in the middle, and what your thoughts are.
I wouldn't hazard a guess about whether that has effects on Malaysian inequality. I'm sure you could tell a story both ways. I don't know enough about the Malaysian economy to make an argument one way or the other about migrant labor. My sense is that if anyone is working and social output is created by multiple people, the welfare that is gained from that should be, whether it's valued, should be valued on whether it's shared across all those people. I think it's just a pure moral principle. So that's my just instinctive sense about it. But I understand people have different opinions.
Ravi?
Well, so I think one should calculate both for the following reason. One of them for moral reasons, and the other one to get a sense of what the politics of this inequality is going to be doing. So if one has a sense that the politics is related to the inequality amongst Malaysian citizens only, the voters only, so to speak, then clearly it's important to know what's happening to that group as a group of voters. So that's a piece of positive analysis. It's worth calculating the Gini. But in terms of the moral basis of the thing, then I would say yes, you should calculate the Gini coefficient, including everybody who's in the country.
Okay, thank you. Before I go to Prof, can you just put some of the Slido questions up? If you have any questions, please put it on Slido. Put up some of the Slido questions. Okay, perhaps you can just ask the panel to have a read through. But in the meantime, so Prof, if I could ask you Jomo, your take on this. I mean, you're a firm believer that we should include everybody in the Gini calculations.
I've argued for quite some time now, something like 3 decades, that discriminating so actively against foreign labor basically depresses the fate of the bottom end of the Malaysian, the workers at the bottom end. I think if we try to remember the graphs which Alan showed, for example, the difference, the premium is least in agriculture and construction. Okay? And I think that's not insignificant because it's precisely there that you have so much foreign labor. Arguably, people say you throw around the figure of 90%. And I think that's very, very telling. So basically, my other objection is a more growth objection, that precisely because you've always had the easy option of cheap foreign labor, the consequence is a Lewisian, a la Arthur Lewis type of labor market. And the consequence of that has actually been to slow down technical change, to slow down the kind of progress you would expect to take place in a middle-income country. So I think this rhetoric about a middle-income trap is misspecified because it attempts to replicate the Latin American discussion in Malaysia, when in fact you don't have a Latin American type situation yet. What you really need is an understanding of what is the nature of the Malaysian economy in order to better analyze the nature of the thwarted progress and development which should take place. I mean, part of it is the deindustrialization story. Part of it is some of the other things, including the turn to services. If we were going to modern services, I think people would have less objection. But what you have is deindustrialization and the expansion of traditional services, to use Alan's term. And that, I think, is a formula for a middle-income trap. So I think we really need to think very, very squarely at this issue in order to make progress. But if I may go to some of Professor Kanbur's questions, I think Professor Jayadev raised the issue of what do we think about the international context and how do we deal with this? I think in addition to migration, which is the movement of labor, what about the movement of goods? In other words, the kind of partial trade liberalization which is being passed off as globalization in this country, as well as the movement of capital and the consequences of that, which I alluded to in the last session. So I think it is precisely that where I fear that the World Bank has no mandate and the World Bank is inadequate to that task. And precisely because of the past behavior of the bank, where for the reasons which Professor Kanbur correctly pointed out, a heavily biased voting structure which favors the OECD economies, the result is that the institutions the bank develops is seen with great suspicion by many developing countries. So, for example, when the bank offered very generously to host the Green Climate Fund, there were no takers among developing countries, despite very generous, because they don't see the bank as an institution which is going to serve the developing countries well. So there was a preference for alternative solutions, and we have seen that work, for example, with the Montreal Protocol, which successfully reduced the emission of chlorofluorocarbons, where Malaysia was one of the leading exporters of air conditioners just 20 years ago. But that was a very successfully implemented protocol. Of course, climate change is much more difficult, but I think with the requisite political will And without this kind of competition among ostensibly multilateral institutions, we would be able to make greater progress.
Thank you. Anyone like to ask a question in person rather than through a computer? Oh, yes.
All right, it's a bit of a long question, so I'm going to have my computer here so I remember everything. So the world that we live in now is one where corporate profits are at record highs, but beneath the
Sorry, I
surface...
can't hear you. Can you put...
Oh, sorry. The world that we live in is one where corporate profits are at record highs, but beneath the surface of this statistic is the fact that these profits or economic rents are increasingly concentrated in the hands of what can be considered to be frontier firms. So you think of, and this happens across all industries. So there's a degree of inequality amongst firms. But besides that, there's also a relationship between where people work and how much they earn. So for instance, a software engineer at Facebook or Google is likely to earn 2 or 3 times more than a software engineer at a startup. Or a professor is likely to earn more at Cornell than the University of Arizona, for example. So this is another source of inequality that's often overlooked. So what kind of policy options exist that can address inequality of this variety in a way that doesn't hinder the market forces that determine the nature of corporate competition?
Sorry, so you're saying people like Google pay higher than everywhere else?
Yeah, and this is like another source of income inequality that is often overlooked.
Okay, well, or Cornell professors earning more than everyone else, which is completely justified, by the way. Good question. So, sorry, Dr. Tilly, you had something? No, okay, all right. So we have that question, and we have a slew of other questions. So maybe I'll give everybody multiple choice. I mean, you can all choose which questions you'd like to answer, but perhaps, Ravi, since it's a Cornell University question, perhaps you could answer that one and choose one of the ones from Slido as well.
So actually, the issue of explanation of wage inequality, of wage variation, is a very big issue in labor economics. Okay? And so you say, well, a person X gets this much, person Y gets this much. What explains the difference is a question. And quite often, it turns out that there's something which you're not capturing in the literature anyway. So you could then you run a regression and you say that the wage is explained by these 6 variables, but there's still a residual, and those are the residuals that you're pointing to. That the person with the same education, the same whatever, the same, et cetera, gets paid differently here rather than there. Why is that? Is that just random occurrence? Or is it that the analyst has missed something? Saying that actually there's something else about these 2 individuals which is different. Now, so there's that explanation. And of course, something that could be different is that there's some form of market power in one situation than in another. And that's typically, we miss that. We miss that type of situation. So, Cornell may well have a monopoly on certain types of education. And so it makes, Cornell is a non-profit, by the way, but I'm just following through your implied analogy. It has a monopoly power in certain segment of the market compared to the University of Arizona. And so it makes monopoly profits, which it then distributes in any way that it can, and among them, Cornell professors get whatever. So this is actually how the labor economics literature proceeds, looking at wage differentials and trying to explain those differences. Now, one thing that actually there's been a lot of focus on is 2 seemingly identical workers, one in Silicon Valley and one in Bangalore, for example, getting paid different amounts. What explains that? Well, again, somebody will say, but there are surely, somebody like speaking Kannada in Bangalore, and that's why you haven't captured that in your regression analysis and so on. So I think that's where the literature now currently stands. One consequence of that is, if it is genuinely true that the 2 software engineers, one in Bangalore, one in Silicon Valley, have genuinely the same productivity, and they're earning different rents. So if you allow migration, that's clearly an economically efficient strategy to be following. So those people who argue for freer migration interpret interpret your empirical characterization in that way.
Can I also just quickly, of course, this is one of the, should we say, new kind of explanations. David Outer and others have been writing about the superstar firm reason for inequality. I think that's what you were referring to. And indeed, it comes with this question of concentration and of market power as being really central to it. I think this is something that we haven't touched upon completely, which is why I wanted to just mention it, which is the worry that with the new technologies which are, and information technology being the way that it is, that with, there are a lot of increasing returns to be had. And so you have monopolization and concentration and potentially owners in those firms becoming extremely wealthy. I think that there's a longer case to be made that this is precisely the reason when markets fail, when you have increasing returns technologies and so on, which require some sort of public intervention. What those are exactly, it depends, whether it's breaking up a monopoly or actually taking over some production by the public sector. But that's where you would go with that.
Thank you. So before, can we have some more Slido questions up? I noticed there are like 8 or 9 questions. We only got 4 here. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can go back to Professor Kanbur's presentation earlier, he puts a great deal of emphasis on technological forces as well as the policy responses. And I think that's quite appropriate. But I would like to add 2 things. One is the so-called functional or factorial distribution of income, something which Alan emphasized in his presentation. And the other is rents. I think we really need to think about what Tan Sri Azman said, referred to earlier as the primary distribution of income. And think about, market institutions are not God-given. They are created. And property rights, for example, anybody who had studied, for example, English land law and looks at the differences between the Sedat and the Torrens system, becomes immediately apparent that there are differences in property rights. And it's not for nothing that French, about 2 centuries ago, referred to property as theft, because it is the appropriation of property by one person or one group of people basically deprives others of that same. So one begins to understand law and power more generally in terms of this. And there's a very rich literature emerging on the relationship between law and economics. And I think this is very fundamental because if we do not question even the primary distribution of income, and we begin with the economic textbook model of perfect competition, then we miss the point. That's why I referred earlier to the work of people like Joseph Stiglitz, Akerlof, and others, and people like Professor Kanbur, who have put a lot of effort into trying to understand imperfect competition and the consequences thereof. And we need to begin to understand and very carefully the question of rents. So what Professor Jayadev emphasized in terms of intellectual property rights have huge implications. If you think, for example, about the recent medication for treatment of hepatitis C. Malaysia, to its credit, the Malaysian Health Ministry has done a deal with an Egyptian supplier, and they will have a treatment, a 12-week treatment for hepatitis C, which will cost 1,300 ringgit. Okay? The current market price for the American patented treatment is around the equivalent of about 350 to 360,000 ringgit. Okay? Compared to 1,300 ringgit. And it's all a question of private property rights. And this became very clear with the Martin Shkreli incident, where the Attorney General of the United States, Loretta Lynch, couldn't prosecute Shkreli for price gouging. She had to prosecute him for running a Ponzi scheme. So we really must take this question of property rights very, very seriously because the implications are very big. And when we sign all these trade treaties, it's not the trade stuff which is objectionable. It's questions such as intellectual property rights, investor-state dispute settlements provisions, which basically abolish the jurisdiction of national courts and allow international arbitration private arbitration arrangements to dictate the terms and of negotiations. So what we now have is actually a market which is emerging, where people are prepared to finance companies to take on cases. So even though you lose 99% of your cases, you can strike it big with one case. You know, that you basically have struck the lottery. So this, I think, is the challenge for the future, and why we have to be very careful. And that's why I was hoping that Dato Mustafa might have stayed for this part of the discussion. But thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Tilly, do you have anything to add on these questions, or no? Okay. So we have about 7 minutes left. Are there any more questions from the floor? Any more? Just one over there. Anyone else have a question from the floor? One over there. Okay, we'll take these last two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jayanath. I just want a quick comment on Jomo talking about ethno-populists. That's only because in the past several decades, the state has abdicated its responsibility to socialize us on a shared vision. And we continue today. But more specifically, maybe it's the rest of the panel can answer, but more specific to the Malaysians in the panel, Jomo and Tilly. The national framework, we are controlled by the central agencies. MOF, EPU, ICU, MAMPU, PMO, these are the people who make the big decisions. I think there needs to be a revamp. If you agree, what do you think should be done to revamp our national framework to address the question of poverty and inequality? Thank you.
Thank you. So a question on decentralization, I think. Yeah. Gentleman over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Ari. There are a lot of learned people on stage and a lot of them in the room, but I'll ask a layman question. I think that we are all talking about the wrong thing. Nobody wants to be equal to anybody else. Everybody wants to be better, which means better in terms of wealth, education, and whatnot. So this competition is never going to end. So shouldn't we be asking how much is enough rather than trying to make everyone equal, because nobody wants that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So quick question, the question on centralization. Dr. Lee, do you think we over-centralize and we should decentralize?
Well, I think, in Peninsular Malaysia, definitely there is concentration power at the federal government level. Revenue raising powers are all with the federal government, with little rights at the state level. Therefore, I believe those state governments which are under opposition control then end up looking how to generate revenue, and this is where I think they end up going for a lot of development projects and the likes, which would give conversion fees and whatnot. So obviously there is need for more balanced rights at the peninsular level. I presume this may also apply insofar as revenue raising goes, even to the East Malaysian states.
Right.
So I just wanted to mention.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think in Dr. Nung's panel just now, they were talking about the same question. Okay, so the final question really is on, and we'll have 5 minutes left, so I think I'll ask everybody else here to give you a quick take on really the philosophical underpinnings of our discussions today, which is, why we're looking for inequality, is there such a thing as enough? And this incredible materialism we see in the modern world, is that really the end of, is that what we're put on earth to do? And other easy questions.
I'll take a first stab. It's obviously a difficult question. I say obviously we do need to ask that question for many reasons about how much we need. I want to slightly disagree that inequality has nothing to do with it, because in fact there's a lot of evidence. Is Robert Frank at Cornell? So another Cornell professor, Robert Frank, has written extensive.
And I'm sure he's paid more than me.
he's written extensively on this, the idea of expenditure cascades, which is the idea that when you have an unequal society, it forces people to spend more and try to consume more in order to keep up with the Joneses, roughly. I do think there is something to that. And part of the reason why we should be concerned about inequality is precisely because it forces people, or rather makes people envious, tries to force people to do things about it. So I don't think they're unrelated, but I think asking about the limits is one of the big questions that we have.
Thank you. That's a good point, actually. It's been said here about weddings. As the rich have more and more bigger and bigger weddings, suddenly the idea of what is a minimum wedding has gone out of hand. And you know, it's true that many young couples find it very difficult to pay off their wedding debts. Just, you know, the pressure to have, you know, a big wedding has got quite intense. Rajesh?
Yeah, and it's also the size of gravestones in graveyards is also just bigger and bigger things, and that's actually evidence is found in China, for example. So let me just slightly push back against that and say that, you know, material things are important. So let's not it's actually quite a ploy of the rich to say that material things are not that important, okay? I'll have my $1 million or whatever it is, and, you know, you should be just happy with your, well, happiness is what's important, and so on. So I would resist that, while, of course, accepting all these other points about that it's relative things that are important, and so on and so forth. What was it somebody said? Happiness is earning $10 more than your brother-in-law was the was the expression that was used. So I always tend to react against the notion that what's important is happiness and not income. I'm sort of suspicious of that, because typically that comes from people who have income and don't want it to be taken away from them through taxation and so on, because it's, you know, what's important is happiness, not income. So my acid test is always, in any of these things, how progressive is the tax and transfer system. That, to me, is a key indicator of the social compact. The full tax and transfer system, not just the formal tax, income tax stuff, and so on and so forth. So that's the indicator that I would use.
Thank you.
Well, so long as we can equalize opportunities, I have no problem with inequality in income, if that inequality income arises from earnings from talent and the likes, then you must tax it properly. Maybe at 25%, I'm happy, maybe a little more, and then give it back to the needy. So I would go along with that, so I have no problem.
Yeah.
But unearned income, how do we deal with that? That's something, and then capital gains tax, how do we deal with that? And then on minimum wage, of course, Professor Kanpur has suggested it may be a good thing, provided it's not too high. So my concern is whether it's too high, whether it may end up too high and therefore cause unemployment. But in the Malaysian context, because Malaysian earnings are higher than in the region, including Bangladesh and Nepal and the like, there is a big pull. Now, with minimum wage, there's even more incentive for employers to hire and engage the services of cheap foreign labor. And therefore, more Malaysians may become unemployed or underemployed, so there are issues like that that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Jomo, a few words?
Yeah, I have great difficulty with those kinds of arguments. I mean, we've had minimum wage for 5 years. We've had full employment for the last 5 years. It's not clear to me that we are necessarily worse off. What bothers me is that the philosophical discussion, if I may, on justice is actually hardly universal. If you think about the Rawlsian arguments about justice at the national level, and then what he argues about international justice, there are double standards involved. And so I don't take I don't think we should go by somebody else's playbook. We need to really think these things basically. But what I think is very sad in our society today is the rise and the increasing assertion of claims legitimizing what, in my view, are illicit income flows. Last week, for example, or maybe it was earlier this week, there was an argument getting half a page in the leading English language newspaper, basically arguing that anybody who opposes strong intellectual property rights is basically a populist. This is scandalous, I think. I think we should have discussions, and we are entitled to have different points of view, and we should have a civilized discussion about these things. But if we continue to perpetuate sort of this blind faith in views from the Thatcher-Reagan revolution of the 1980s, we are going to have a lot of problems. I mean, the resurgence, for example, of the Laffer curve, which is more laughable than a Laffer curve, claiming that if you don't tax, there will be more income, which will then invest, and then you can have higher growth. I mean, there's no empirical basis. In fact, Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, himself actually refuted it. So there's no basis for this, but it is this kind of very touching sort of faith in purported free markets, and they're not really free markets, which I think is misleading a lot of Malaysians, and we need to have a more balanced discussion. And that's why I really appreciate the initiative in organizing this, and Tuanku, your presence and support for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Tuanku, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming almost to the end of this panel. The thing about inequality and fairness and justice and all that is that, and unearned income, is that my income is earned and I deserve what I make. Your income is unearned and should be taxed, and you should be brought down to my level. So there's always this real problem about, fairness is so much in the eye of the beholder. But, it's a fascinating conversation. We've had a whole day of very heavy discussions on inequality. And so please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.